You know, what happens when a marriage ends and one person is left with almost nothing while the other is, well, incredibly wealthy? We're about to dive into a real court case that asks a really tough question. Where does financial support end and where does personal responsibility begin? This is a story of two very different incomes and one very surprising verdict.
So let's start with a little puzzle. Put yourself in this situation. Your rent is more than double your entire weekly income. You say you can't work more because the mental anguish from your failed marriage has left you unable to cope. But your ex? He's very, very well off. Is he on the hook to cover that difference? A judge had to figure that out. And take a look at this. This isn't just a gap, it's a massive financial canyon. On one side, you have Ms. Bain bringing in about $200 a week. On the other side, her ex-husband, Mr. Bailey, is pulling in around $4,500 every single week. This huge disparity is the battlefield where this whole story unfolds.
Okay, let's get into the details of this case, which comes from an Australian court. Ms. Bain isn't just asking for a little bit of help to get by. She's demanding $1,150 per week, arguing it's the only way she can survive. But is her situation really as impossible as she says? Or is there maybe another side to this story?
Now, what's interesting is their relationship went on for 6 years, but the actual marriage? It was surprisingly short. When it all fell apart back in 2012, Miss Bain took Mr. Bailey to court, claiming she was left completely unable to support herself.
Let's be crystal clear about Mr. Bailey's finances. The man earns over $236,000 a year. He has a surplus of more than $1,400 every single week. He wasn't even arguing that he couldn't afford to pay, so this whole legal fight wasn't about whether he could pay, but whether he should have to.
So, how does Mrs. Bain build her case? Well, her story is one of a woman who was left absolutely broken by the end of her marriage. She paints a picture of someone who's mentally and emotionally wounded, and she's got a doctor's report that she says proves it.
Her argument in court was pretty simple and direct. The stress from the breakup caused severe depression and anxiety, which left her with a diagnosed mental incapacity for full-time work. With a tiny income and huge expenses, including that $500 a week for rent, she argued her ex had more than enough cash to fill that gap.
And here it is, her key piece of evidence, a report from her psychologist. It states right there in black and white that her inability to work is a long-term medical problem. I mean, on the surface, her case looks rock solid, right? How can a judge possibly argue with a medical professional? Well, as it turns out, Mr. Bailey had a very, very different story to tell.
Mr. Bailey's defense wasn't just no, he launched a full-on counterattack on her entire story. His goal was to paint a picture of her not as a victim, but as someone who was perfectly capable of working, but was choosing not to, all while trying to fund an expensive lifestyle on his dime.
His legal team went on the offensive. First, they questioned her psychologist, calling her less of an independent expert and more of an advocate. Then, they brought up the fact that she'd just successfully completed a really demanding full-time course. They also attacked her expenses, asking why a single person needed a 3-bedroom house that cost $500 a week. But his biggest move? Bringing in his own expert.
And this is where it all gets really, really complicated. An independent forensic psychologist hired by Mr. Bailey came to the exact opposite conclusion. He said that, in his professional opinion, Ms. Bain was capable of going back to work full-time, right now. And that just created a massive problem for the judge.
I mean, this is the ultimate headache for a judge, isn't it? You have two qualified experts looking at the exact same person and giving completely opposite opinions. One says she can't work, the other says she can. So, who do you believe?
So here's the conflict in a nutshell, on every single key point. Her ability to work, what the experts said, and her living expenses, they were just worlds apart. And you gotta remember, this was all for an interim order, which means the judge had to make a fast, practical decision without the luxury of a long, drawn-out trial. So what did the judge do? He didn't just pick a side. Instead, he used a really clever legal framework to cut right through all the conflicting stories and find a practical solution, somewhere in the middle. He started with a simple 2-step test. Step 1. Can the husband pay? The answer was a clear and obvious yes. That was the easy part. But then he got to the real heart of the matter. Is the wife truly unable to support herself adequately? And his answer to that was a very careful, partially. So the judge didn't fully buy either psychologist's report.
He looked at all the evidence, especially the fact that she just finished that demanding course, and decided her claim that she could only work 2 days a week just wasn't credible. But he also didn't fully agree with Mr. Bailey that she could just jump back into full-time work. Instead, he made his own assessment. She was capable of working at least 4 days a week.
So how did he land on a final number? Well, first, he calculated her potential earnings at 4 days a week, which came out to $400. Then, he asked a really important question. Is $400 a week enough for adequate support? To get an objective answer, he used a benchmark, the national minimum wage at the time, which was about $622 a week. And that's how we get the final number, $250 per week. That amount was specifically calculated to bridge the gap between what she could potentially earn and that minimum wage benchmark. It is a tiny, tiny fraction of the $1,150 she asked for, but in the eyes of the law, it was just enough to ensure a basic, adequate standard of living.
So what does this case really mean for you, or for anyone else? It shows that spousal support is not about funding a particular lifestyle. It's about meeting a proven and reasonable need. If you're going to claim you can't work, you'd better have some really credible evidence. And at the end of the day, the court is always going to look for that middle ground based on what's reasonable, not just what someone wants.
This case gave a temporary legal solution for Ms. Bain and Mr. Bailey, but it leaves all of us with a much bigger question to think about. When our relationship is over, where do we as a society draw the line between a legal duty to support someone and the personal responsibility we all have to stand on our own 2 feet? The law has an answer, but what's yours?